Just a quick recap. It's wonderful to be with you all again. Thanks for having me. A brief recap of what we saw last week. Last week we opened um, our investigation of housing and homelessness and rabbinic thought and law. Um, First, by looking at an early midrashic story about a second century sage, Rabbi Aryeh ben Hanania, who encounters in Rome, which literally symbolizes the evil empire, the occupying force. There he sees something that we actually see, unfortunately, all the time on LaSalle Street, on State Street, in every big city in America. Great public expenditure into preserving fancy public buildings, where as human beings right in front of them go without and freeze in the cold. And we talked about what that meant and trying to get ourselves into the posture of always being shocked and horrified at that experience, which seems to be what the Midrash is trying to evoke in us, and to the point of interpreting the fact of that kind of wealth inequality and callousness to poverty as, to interpret that with shock, with a kind of biblical register in our language. Then we moved into a legal question, whether housing is a civil right. We saw that in the book of Devarim, Deuteronomy talks about providing economically for a person who needs, with a kind of redundant phrase, enough for his lack, whatever is lacking for him. And we saw that the Talmud unpacks all the core pieces of economic welfare that a society is obligated to provide for people. The example, falling through the cracks, is an orphan, and the definition of enough for one's lack is a house, and then it has to be a furnished house, as well as stability, human relationships, spouse, etc. So in other words, housing was considered, according to the Talmud and Ketubot, a core civic responsibility for every person. After that, we looked, just for background, to look at biblical welfare structures, the four agricultural welfare structures, and we saw that the Mishnah legislated that eligibility for welfare is judged only based on one's liquid assets, and that one is not obligated to sell one's house or basic possessions in order not to have to, even if that would put one over the poverty line. Poverty line does not count against your housing. We want to keep people housed. If an anti-poverty program, as welfare should be, is about getting people back on their feet, the last thing we want to do is remove people out of stable housing. And great, so that's basically what we saw last week. We didn't do the latter part of that sheet. We'll come back to some of that next week, hopefully. Tonight, I want us to pivot to thinking more broadly about housing in Jewish law. It's, in order to understand homelessness, I think we have to understand all the different gradations. I think those of us who are housed and have been securely housed our entire lives might have a tendency to think about houselessness or housedness in binary terms. There are homeless people, and there's the image, like in the Midrash we saw Rabbi Aryeh ben Hanania in Rome, and certainly in our experience here, there's an image of people sleeping in the street or in the train platform or whatever the case may be. And then there are people who have secure housing. The reality of homelessness, according to all the homeless organizations, is that a lot of people who are houseless are in unstable situations, bouncing from couch to couch, or facing housing insecurity A lot of people aren't necessarily homeless for years on end. They move in and out of unstable housing to houselessness, maybe doubling up with a relative, etc. We have to get, if we want to understand the problem in its fullness as it exists, we have to look into the obligations of landlords to tenants and the rights of tenants. That's really where houselessness where the rubber hits the road on homelessness, is where people are pushed out of tenuous housing that they have. So what are the obligations of a landlord? That's going to be our main question. I'm going to post a link to the document we're going to use tonight in the chat, and I'll share screen and access it that way too. But in case you want to open it or enlarge it or manipulate the text as you wish, you have it there too. Before we jump into it, did anybody have any questions or comments or thoughts about this pivot before we jump in?
Well, when I lived in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and if you're not familiar with Santa Fe, most people think of it as a very lovely vacation destination, lots of art, skiing, whatever. But I worked for the Santa Fe Public School District. And when I first started working there, my boss said, forget what you know about Santa Fe. Santa Fe is some rich people and some very poor people and like a little thin spread of middle-class people in the middle. But we had out of maybe 12 to 14,000 students, 1,500 of them were homeless, meaning not that they slept on the sidewalk, but their parents were lodging with relatives, or, living in their car, or, as you say, bouncing from one place to another with no stability. So homelessness encompasses a lot more than just those people on LaSalle Street sleeping in doorways. I mean, many children are homeless, even though they're sleeping somewhere out of the cold at night. But
Thank you.
I agree with your.
Thank you. And so halachically, we're going to be interested in seeing not just responses to, we saw an agadic, a sort of folklore narrative, emotional reaction of one rabbi to seeing somebody in the depths of homelessness. And we saw some early preemptive halachot about, like, there's an orphan, what does the court, the whole community have responsibility? The vast majority of us, though, are on just the regular housing market. And sometimes often homelessness comes because of a combination of bad fortune happening simultaneously. So loss of a job, in this country especially, illness, when health insurance is not necessarily covered. So a combination of loss of a job, illness, or a relative with an illness, so you can't do your job because you're caring for them, getting behind on rent, and so on and so on and so on. So what are the responsibilities of a landlord to tenants? Although there are many renters who are actually quite wealthy in our world, which is somewhat an unusual historical phenomenon. Most of the legislation around tenant rights and landlord obligations is going to have an eye on preventing those who are potentially vulnerable from falling through the cracks. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen and we'll just jump right into it. Here we go. So as we said, the problem of homelessness goes well beyond having a roof or not, to include health, safety, and poverty effects caused by housing insecurity and quality. So moving beyond general societal responsibility to make sure everyone has housing, what do the rabbis say about specific responsibilities upon those who control other people's housing? These middle categories that can make one vulnerable to homelessness. So this is from the tractate of the Mishnah called Bava Metzia. So again, we're in the Mishnah is the core text of rabbinic law, the building block of both Talmuds. Bava Metzia is a tractate that deals with kind of potpourri of economic law. And here in the 8th chapter, we get housing landlord responsibilities. Would somebody like to be our first reader and read these three Mishnayot, these three Mishnah texts?
Sure.
Thanks, Phyllis.
One who rents a house to another in the rainy season may not evict them from Sukkot until Pesach. In the summer, 30 days before Sukkot, and in large, is that a sentence? No. And in large cities, whether during the rainy season or the summer, 12 months.
Okay, so let's pause there. I think verbs are sometimes assumed because think of whenever you've read legal text before, like the later clauses might speak in shorthand, especially because the Mishnah was an oral text. So we get all the case in the first sentence, and then we get some variations. One who rents a house to another person, colon. In the rainy season, their regulations are that they're not allowed to evict them between Sukkot to Pesach. In the land of Israel, that's the rainy season. As you might recall from the prayer, from the liturgy, in the Amidah prayer, we say Mashiv HaRuach U'Morid HaGashem, the prayer for rain. We actually start a little bit later than Sukkot for interesting historical reasons, but it's a little bit after Sukkot. And on Sukkot, we start saying, in Simchat Torah, we start saying Geshem, Shmini Atzeret, the prayer for rain. Pesach, we start Tal. So in any event, in the rainy season, you can't evict somebody. In the summer, which is Pesach to Sukkot, you have to give somebody 30 days. Okay, so like that's the limitation. You are allowed to evict somebody, but you have to give them 30 days. That's the fair amount. And in large cities, whether during the rainy season or the summer, 12 months, which might tell us something about the reality of housing stock and turnover and availability in large cities. It might tell us something about housing costs, housing being more expensive. It might tell us about lack of availability of temporary solutions, whereas in small places things would be available. Any other thoughts about why the difference between winter and summer? Why is it why are there more restrictions on a landlord? Landlord's not allowed to evict somebody at all from Sukkot, between Sukkot and Pesach. So in the summer, they can, provided that they tell them 30 days ahead of time. So what's the difference?
The weather is inclement in the rainy season and harder to survive. Maybe in the summer you can find some place to stay without endangering your health.
Great. Even, I mean, in the land of Israel, the Mediterranean climate, most places it's going to cool off at night. So even if you are homeless, but especially in rural areas, you might be able to, like in the old days, access natural resources to build yourself a tent, a hut, sleep outside, etc. The winter, that's not viable. It's too cold, too rainy. Okay, so let's move on to, yeah, David, go ahead.
Point of clarification. When it says in the summer 30 days before Sukkot, does that mean, like, is that in the summer bracket before Sukkot 30 days?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Yeah.
And
okay.
then also, how does it work? Like, if you would be evicting somebody because they couldn't pay their rent, then once you've established that they can't pay their rent and you live in a large city, does the Gemara explain how it's like you're supposed to put up with another year's worth of like?
So hold on to that question. Hold on to that question. It's a good question.
Great.
We may not answer it directly on that Mishnah, but we'll see material that addresses that
Okay.
concern. What part of our question is, what is a rental agreement? And what power does a landlord have and what obligations does a landlord have structurally? Phyllis, go ahead with Mishnah 7, Mishnah Zayin.
One who rents a house to another The landlord is obligated regarding the door, the bolt, and the lock, and anything which is the work of an artisan. But as for anything which is not the work of an artisan, the tenant makes it. The manure belongs to the owner of the house, and the tenant may claim only what comes out from the oven and from the stove.
Okay, so let's first just unpack the first part of that Mishnah. And this is actually fairly similar to landlord-tenant obligations in most places today, that the landlord has to provide anything that an average civilian couldn't be expected to take care of themselves. Anything that you have to hire a specialist to make has to be part of what an apartment comes by. You can't say, well, you have a roof over your head, you're on your own to figure out like security. No, basic security and anything that's the work of an artisan is on you. But tenants, you know, the landlord is not obligated to provide a fully furnished place. Anyone can paint their own apartment. So if you don't like it, don't paint it, you know, things like that. Those aren't things that require an artisan. Okay. As far as like the manure, just it's hard, you know, think about, you know, even in America, even in the Chicago area, pre the mid 20th century, and all the zoning innovations that happened then to separate rural and urban or suburban areas from each other. It was much more common for livestock to live, intermingle with people in residential communities. We're starting to see it again now in some municipalities. People can raise chickens in their backyard or even raise a goat occasionally in a smaller number of places. It used to be much more common. So even a renter, you might have animals, like there's going to be a field, a yard, a courtyard, and animals who are there. So the question is, you know, if you think like a farmer, manure is actually not just a problem for removal, it's actually a valuable commodity for fertilization of the ground and so on. So this Mishnah, we're not going to deal with this to a great degree, but the manure belongs to the owner, the landlord. The tenant can own, you know, any ashes that come, like if you are cooking as a tenant in your house, you can keep the ashes for your own artisanal or fertilization projects. Let's kind of bracket that and move on. Phyllis, take us through Mishnah 9.
One who rents a house to another and it fell is obligated to set up a house for them. If it was small, one may not make it large. If it was large, one may not make it small. If it was a single unit, they may not make it two. If it was two, they might not make it one. They may not make it one. They may not reduce the windows nor increase them without their mutual consent.
Okay, so you're renting what might actually be a substandard unit because it falls down. Or maybe there was just a terrible earthquake or fire, whatever the case may be. So first of all, basic premise, the landlord has to replace it, has to rebuild it. What do you make of all these stipulations that the landlord has to keep it in the same type of housing stock that it was before? Why, let's say you're renting a small unit, why should there be a restriction on the landlord from rebuilding it larger?
Because if the landlord makes it larger, then the landlord can change the amount they're charging for it.
Yeah.
Right. Any other, thank you, David. Any other fears? Like let's try to think about the world of tenants and landlords today. What do landlords, especially landlords who own substandard buildings, what are their interests sometimes?
To rent to more people.
Sometimes they want to like keep a revolving door.
Well, I mean, more of a larger number of people to make smaller units and have more income.
Great. So making it smaller, they might want to subdivide. What about making it larger? I mean, David mentioned that they might directly be able to raise rent. But there's a
So gentrifying.
Thank you, Cynthia. Say more about that.
Well, we've seen it, haven't we, in Chicago, where Cabrini Green got torn down and very expensive townhomes were
Yeah.
placed there. So to David's point, not only is it higher rent, but it's an entirely different class that's
Yeah.
now able to access the community. It really changes the nature of who lives where. Often, I think you might have mentioned this, or something else I was hearing this week reminded me of the devastation caused by the Eisenhower and other
Mhm.
expressways that savaged neighborhoods. It was not just, it was changing the whole character.
Right.
of
They
the
always
community.
went through black neighborhoods or poor neighborhoods and not rich ones in order to connect
Yeah.
different white neighborhoods to each other more conveniently. That's a very subtle observation, Cynthia, because you can imagine, like, well, what if the court actually just regulated and said, hey, this person at a concert and assumed like you can't raise their rent, but they didn't ask you to build a bigger place. They didn't ask you to have a substandard unit. You have to like rebuild it new for them. If you want to build it bigger, that's not the tenant's burden. However, even if the court was able to enforce that locally, so there shouldn't be any restriction on it, it might have impacts on changing the neighborhood in ways that destabilize the community. I think that's a very subtle reading. There's a middle reading between David's reading and Cynthia's reading too, that I want to offer, which is that rebuilding a different kind of housing stock than that the person was accustomed to can be a way to push them out in a lot of different ways. Taking advantage of the fact that you rented out a substandard unit that fell down as an opportunity to destabilize them and get them out. So for example, let's say there's a single person and you rebuild a much, or maybe let's say a senior, and you rebuild a much bigger unit that's going to be much harder to maintain. And it's not what they need. They need a simple place to live, and either because they travel, because they're a senior, whatever the case may be, it's not appropriate to their needs now. It can be a way to push them out. So without having to evict them, they'll move on their own, and then you can flip and change your unit. You're not allowed to do that. So the Mishnah is coming in to prevent all of that. And in terms of like, if it fell down and now you're rebuilding, any structural changes or remodeling have to be by agreement between the landlord and the tenant. Even things about, the numbers of windows and so on. Okay, but it has to be the same kind of housing stock. We see one Talmudic addition that expands on, mainly on Mishnah 7 about landlord obligations in terms of the furnishings and so on. So one who rents a house to another, the landlord is obligated to set up doors, open up windows, reinforce the ceiling, and fix beams. When we said, the work of an artisan, this Breita, this non-Mishnaic, similar to the Mishnah teaching, gives a little more detail as to what we should be thinking about. The tenant has to set up a ladder, make a parapet, a security thing on the roof, because the landlord can just say, don't go to the roof. But it's the resident who lives there who is required to put in a parapet so that they don't fall off the roof, make a roof gutter tube, plaster the ceiling, the personal use things, and things that an average, in their context, average person can do. But fixing beams is a professional job. So you can imagine.
I have a huge problem with the parapet being the tenant's responsibility.
Say more about that.
Well, we know that it's one of the, everyone talks about that as a core example of an obligation of one who owns some form of property that could pose a risk. I don't see how the tenant acquires that obligation. There's probably Gemara on it, but
Yeah, my guess is that, roofs are not necessarily accessible. And when it says a tenant is obligated to set up a ladder, I think what that means is, I don't think that means you must have a ladder to the roof. I think it means that if you want a ladder to the roof, it's the tenant's obligation to do it and can't charge that to the landlord.
Oh,
And if
that's
you
fair.
do that, if the roof is accessible, if you've made the roof accessible, as many tenants will want to do, then there's a mitzvah to build a parapet. But there's an interesting question. What if the ladder is talking about like a fire escape type of ladder? So yeah, I think it's good to flag that and to wonder as an interesting, what are the fault lines? And today, what would equivalent fault lines be? What do we think of as basic, kind of security measures? Similarly today, landlords have to put in sufficient locks, but they're not generally obligated to provide an alarm system. When you think about something like a parapet. So there are some security things that landlords institute and some that tenants institute. Having
Thank
seen these Mishnaic sources, Talmudic sources as a kind of overview, I want to take note of how the Rambam, something the Rambam says. The Rambam, it's worth noting, generally doesn't go off script. In his magisterial 14-volume code, the Mishnah Torah, which was the first topically organized code of Jewish law, where he took the kind of cacophony of the Talmud, removes its discursive elements and puts it into a topical code. And usually he sticks to Talmudic sources, Talmudic language, translates Aramaic into Hebrew, cleans things up a little bit, just chooses which view he thinks is the decisive view, and so on. He doesn't add much expansion of his own. Let's see what he says in his laws of renting in this passage. Kay or Cynthia, you want to read this passage?
I can read.
Thanks, Kay.
Who rents a house to another without specification may not evict them without notifying them 30 days in advance, so as to enable them to find a place and not be thrown into the street. And at the end of those 30, they must leave. When does this apply? In the summer. But during the rainy season, they may not evict them at all from Sukkot until Pesach.
Okay, now legally speaking, thank you, Kay. Legally speaking, the Rambam hasn't added anything to what we saw in the Mishnah, other than in that first line saying that this is all referring to a rental agreement that doesn't have time specificity worked into the contract. So these are the rules in general. Today, it might be a little different because it's standard to have a time specification for a rental agreement. Why do you think the Rambam is so uncharacteristically going off script and adding the words that are in italics, which are not derived from the Talmudic material? Enable them to find a place and not be thrown in the street. What's the Rambam engaging in these histrionics for? It's not his usual style. And this is not a right or wrong answer. This is a speculation. How do you read that? What's he trying to do here?
He's outraged.
Say more.
He's a physician. He's angry and he sees the consequences.
Yeah, I think something that's a nice way to put it. I think the Rambam is sort of connecting these relatively dry Mishnayot about, landlord obligations. He's sort of making a through line to essentially what we did at the beginning last week, to like that story of the Midrash. Remember when I said part of our purpose here is to ground ourselves in an emotional register of how we should be thinking about the consequences. And now we're pivoting to the nitty-gritty laws that often seem very removed from that. The landlord might say, "Oh, it's just contract law." But what's at stake in these nitty-gritty of this aspect of contract law is keeping people safe and housed and not being thrown into the street. The Rambam's using this sort of graphic language, I think, to draw our attention to what's at stake here. Now, different economies, the specifics might be different in different weather economies, or the time frame might be different. in a very cold climate as opposed to a Mediterranean climate. But that's the principle. What I want to do in our remaining time is actually look at the ways in which some of these principles have been applied by later authorities. And generally in economic law, there's a lot of variation depending on the economy in which different post-game, different authorities are living in, as I think is appropriate. And the question is, how do we take the principles and apply them in whatever condition we're in to make sure that they're applying in the right ways, to make sure that the right obligations and the right rights are imposed. So here we have a text that's the ruling of the rabbis of Mekknus, Morocco. I actually don't know from when in history this ruling is from. It's cited in a book of Rabbi Professor Moshe Amar, Sefer Takanot. It's a 1996 book, but he's collecting rulings of the sages of Mekknus, Morocco from earlier times. I actually don't know when this ruling is from. I saw it in a presentation by Dr. Raphael Megarek and Tamar Zaken. Trua, if you're familiar with Trua, it's like originally it was American Rabbis for Human Rights. It's now an independent Rabbis and Cantors human rights organization in the United States. Anyway, Trua put together this series last year during the pandemic on different halachic issues that come up during the COVID-19 pandemic. And so Raphael Megarek and Tamar Zaken jointly taught the session and wrote this sheet that's loaded on Sefaria on the question of rent cancellation. So in that context, they brought this source, which I've not seen in the original. I just saw how they brought it. So the rabbis of Mekknus, Morocco say, Cindy, do you want to read this text?
Yes, thank you. We have agreed and set forth a ruling that whoever rents an apartment from this day onward, the owner shall not be able to make the renter leave it for a whole year.
Okay, so let's just pause there. Let's just pause there for a second. So in the Mishnah and the Rambam, there seems to be an assumption that your baseline lease was that landlords could just say, here's a place you can move in on such and such a date, and they wouldn't specify the duration of the lease. The rabbis of Mekknus, Morocco are saying, henceforth, we are instituting that there's going to be a standard lease of a year, so that landlords can't muck around and claim that they said one thing. Or leases have a year. Go ahead.
The year will start in the month of Iyar and end in the month of Iyar. So that's actually 13 months. And the owner will not be able to make this person leave at all throughout this time. And the owner shall not increase the amount of rent due. And the only time that the amount could be raised is in the month of Iyar specifically. And even if the owner should make an agreement with the person renting the apartment to let him live there for 6 months, the owner still does not have the right to make him leave without his will before the month of Iyar. And we shall keep this ruling as our custom here for all generations to come.
Thank you, Cindy. Now, let's just unpack. What are we? So we see, first of all, they're saying a standard lease is 1 year. And apartment changeover time is in the springtime. Presumably, I'm guessing that's a combination of weather and after Pesach. So, people have more time. What do you make of the clause, the owner will not be able to make this person leave at all throughout this time? What's the breadth of application of that statement?
It seems like there's no loopholes.
So going back to David's question before, what if the tenant doesn't pay rent?
Exactly.
What if the tenant defaults on rent? Does it mean
Right.
except for that, or
Right, or trashes the place, or
right? Are there
violates other, yeah.
Is it totally restricted? Is eviction totally not allowed? I mean, I think David's confusion and surprise at the Mishnah, and our questions here are grounded in, I mean, we're in a reality where landlords have a lot of leeway, and rental agreements are treated generally in American law as standard contracts, as though they're two equal parties entering into a standard contract. And so violation of terms of a contract are grounds for dissolution of the contract. And I just want to introduce us to the notion that in halakha that might not be the case. Is there a blanket prohibition on eviction for during this 12 months? You can't kick them out until ER. Maybe that means, if they don't pay rent, they might owe you money and you can sue them. But the fact that you can sue them already from the rabbis and Mekknus might not mean that you can evict them. So we'll understand more theoretically how that might be in some coming sources. And finally, look at the last part, that they're open to the utility of shorter term leases. It might not actually help all vulnerable people that all leases have to be 12 months. Sometimes you want a shorter period of rental. Maybe you're renovating and you need a short-term rental, or maybe you're a contract worker and you're visiting town, you're a traveler and you want a 3-month or 6-month lease. Even if they agree to a shorter period, if then that time ends, and it's Kislev, and they agreed that the time is now up, the owner still can't evict them until ER.
But it says the owner still does not have this right to make him leave without his will.
Right.
I guess if the renter wants to leave.
Absolutely right. So what they're acknowledging is that there might be mutually agreed upon short-term rentals. But if I rent to you, Phyllis, and we agree on a 4-month rental that ends around Hanukkah time in Kislev, and now I say, well, it's the end of our rental period, and you say you're not leaving yet, I still can't kick you out until the time when housing turns over in ER. But we're allowed to make that agreement, and you want to leave, then you're not obligated to pay several more months of rent, even though you're moving in Kislev, because that's what you wanted. So we're allowed to make a shorter term thing, but the landlord doesn't have power to evict even in that situation. So I want to just briefly entertain with you, is non-payment of rent a legal ground for eviction? We saw in the ruling of the rabbis in Mekknus, Morocco, it sounds, they weren't explicit, but by their broad language, it sounds like non-payment of rent is not a legal ground for eviction. It might be grounds for non-renewal at the time when contracts come up, and you might be able to sue the person for the money they owe you, but the language sounded very broad. I want to look at some halachic sources that are more explicit. It's possible that that's an overreading of the rabbis of Mekknus, and they just mean that that you won't be able to leave at all throughout this time unless the person trashes the place or doesn't pay rent. Now let's see. So most halachic opinions think that non-payment of rent can be a legal ground for eviction, but there's not consensus on that. That itself is significant in our American context. That is not settled law. So here is the comment of the Ritba, who is a very important 13th, early 14th century Spanish sage from the school of the Ramban, Nachmanides, 2 generations after him. Very one of the heavy hitters of Spanish Sephardic Talmudic commentary and legal exegesis. So in his commentary on a Talmudic source that we're not looking at, he compares it. What the case is not really germane to us right now. Listen to what he says sort of by assumption. It's comparable to a case in which the father rented a house out to somebody. Sorry, the father rented a house as a renter and died. in which case, the Ritva assumes this to be the case, the inheritors use it for the entirety of his rental, but they're not obligated in the rent. So just think about this. I don't know if any or all of you have children, but so if you rented a unit and then 3 months into your 12-month lease, God forbid, you pass away, your children have the legal right to live in that unit for the duration of your lease, and they do not have the obligation to pay rent. How can that be? Why? Why would those two things not be linked? So a contemporary rabbi named Baruch Meir Levin wrote this book, Landlord-Tenant Halacha, just 3 years ago, comments on unpacking what the Ritva means. Just so that's his explanation. Would not be able to evict them from the house, would only be able to continue to strive to receive the rental payment. You can sue, you can ask for it, but you can't kick them out. So Rabbi Akiva Eger, very important 18th and early 19th century commentator, he didn't necessarily agree with the Ritva. You see in his first paragraph, he says that I would think they would need to pay the rent. But starting where it says nonetheless, he entertains this other possibility, which he then quotes the Ritva. Says it's possible to say that immediately when their father rented, he took on a monetary debt and he acquired the usage right. In other words, rent obligation and right to the apartment are two separate legal entities, though they come together simultaneously, but they're actually not identical. And the inheritors can say, our father died and we inherit the usage right, but we're not going to pay his debt. It's like somebody who bought movable objects and but you haven't paid yet. So let's say I buy some food. I have a regular food order. The delivery came and I haven't paid for it yet. And then I die in between receiving the order and paying. My child can eat that food, but does not have an obligation to pay that debt. You have to pay inherited real estate debts, but not movable object debts. So here too, a temporary rental is like that kind of a purchase. Now, if you're getting lost in the details, that's okay. It took me a while on this too. It's confusing for the American mind. The important thing here is for us to recognize that it's possible that halacha, and it's possible for any legal system to disaggregate the right to live in a place and debt. So here, Raphael McGarrick and Tamar Zaken really unpack and explain it. Phyllis, I think we're back to you. Do you want to read their explanation of this?
Sure. Rabbi Akiva Eger in his second analysis suggests that a rental contract may not be a repeated exchange of fee for service, such that missing a month's rent means logically you don't get that month of usage. Rather, it's an upfront exchange of two things. You obligate yourself financially, and then secondarily, you acquire the right to live somewhere. If so, logically, when for one reason or another, something comes along and eliminates or modifies that financial obligation, 12 months of rent, say, nothing follows about your right to remain in the rental.
So just before you go on, let's try to just think in our mind, what are the kinds of things that might eliminate or modify that financial obligation? They're talking about a global pandemic that neither side was taking into consideration when they made financial assumptions about the worth of property and its proximity to work and so on. There might be other things, maybe just your personal finances change. So it doesn't automatically follow that your right to remain in the unit is affected by that. Go on.
In American law, there is a parallel distinction between debt that is evictable and consumer debt. That is, if you happen independently to owe your landlord money, say you bought a car from them and never paid, that is typically not evictable.
So we understand that point. Is that, so let's say that, so I was renting for 6 years from Mac Properties. But it's better if you have an individual person who's your landlord. So let's say that my landlord is, Ruvain McGillicuddy, and Ruvain McGillicuddy rents me a unit independently. Ruvain runs a business. Ruvain, in addition to renting out the second unit in a duplex, Ruvain is a car dealer. I also buy a car from him. And maybe it's not a good idea to mix your work, but so I, independently to my lease rental agreement, I happen to buy a car from him, and I default on my payments. So it is generally agreed upon that he can't use his power over me as a landlord to evict me to recover that money. He sues me for the money I owe him for the car, but he doesn't have a right, even though he's the same person, he doesn't have a right to evict me on that basis. Okay, that seems understandable in the American context. And McGarrick and Zaken are helping us understand that the Ritva is expanding that point more generally about rent. Go on, the point is.
The point is that it is not so clear that Jewish law regards rental payments as evictable. You may owe the landlord money and they can take you to a court and claim it, but they cannot necessarily evict you.
One more paragraph.
As a matter of practical halacha, the practice is not to rule like these opinions in the usual case of the defaulting tenant. But in this case, Rabbi Akiva Eger and Ritva provide another access of doubt, which detaches the question of whether the tenant pays from whether they can remain in the apartment. That is, the Ritva would seem to say, if collective disaster reduces the rent, that has no bearing on whether the tenant can stay in the apartment, a right they acquired when they signed their rental contract.
Okay, we're 2 minutes over time now, so we're going to pause there. Well, I think because it's a very rich material, we'll pick up and hear these last two sources next week before we then shift into thinking about homeowners and zoning and what are the ways in which the experience of homelessness or housing insecurity or poverty or wealth gaps can be manifested by choices of homeowners and what rights and restrictions they have. First, next week, we will start with the last two sources here that will help us conceptually to understand really what's at stake in possibly delinking rent from eviction. They're writing in the context, McGarrick and Zaken are writing in the context of the movement for rent cancellation. I mean, there were these emergency restrictions on evictions during the pandemic because, it would be especially disastrous to have increased homelessness during a global pandemic where the main thing people need to do is shelter in place. But more fundamentally, that crisis, I think, is an invitation for us to think about what is the landlord-tenant relationship? What's its relationship to housing security, housing stability? What responsibility does the landlord have for the well-being of a tenant? What assumptions about the economy, the local economy, does the landlord make in order to rent to a tenant, and what restrictions, what burden does the landlord bear if economic situations change? So we will close that loop next week, and then move into questions about bourgeois life and homeowners and zoning and NIMBY, not in my backyard, and how those all affect housing homelessness. David, I'll pass it back to you for closing and announcements. I mean, I'm happy to stick around another couple minutes if people want, but I also know that we're over time. So I didn't want to keep going.
Thank you. I will check the link for next week.
But there's a board meeting next Wednesday. Oh, no, it's Wednesday night.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, the executive meeting is usually on a Wednesday, so I don't
Yeah.
know why it got moved and caused a problem. Let's assume that we're on the first link next week, and if for some reason it's not working, we'll come to the second link. But I will double check in the meantime to see if we have any issues, and if so, we'll alert you that that's coming up. But thank you so much, Aryeh. This was informative and gave us a lot to think about.
My
And we-
pleasure.
Can we also remind people that there's a presentation on Sunday at 11 o'clock
Great.
on the significant things we can do to combat climate change.
Yes.
And so I hope you will come. You all know how to get there? Have you all seen it?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes, I'll be running Hebrew school, but I hope that it goes.
Yes.
Phyllis, I just put the proposed legislative bill in the chat in case anyone wants to look into it. It's directly related to what we're talking about today.
Sure is. It sure is. We have to do something about this. Yeah.
Thank you
So
very
all
much.
your legislators, your state legislators.
Absolutely. Thanks
Thanks,
for the link. I
everybody.
just opened it up. See you next week. Shabbat shalom.
Thank you.
Bye.